Perfect. So to start off, we just wanted to say thank you so much for being here with us today. It means a lot, and we think your experience will be really valuable to share with the Queen's community. So the first question we had for you is, can you tell us a bit about yourself and bridging finance?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me as well. Just maybe a little bit about myself. I'm a lawyer by training. Went to Queen's Law, graduated in 1995, and got was called the bar in 1997. My interests were much like Amy's. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I went to law school, and I sort of got funneled into corporate securities law almost by default because I just didn't know anything about anything. I come from a family that doesn't have much education. Proud people, but my mother has grade 8 and my dad grade 9. So we didn't talk about university at all and these types of things. I wasn't exposed to it. So going to Queens was very foreign for me. I because I wasn't used to interacting with people like that. I did have an undergrad degree, but it took me a while to get it because I was playing hockey. And hockey really, for me, was a vehicle to go to school because I really just didn't know about this university world. And I got a hockey scholarship down to the United States, and that opened university up to me. But if it wasn't for hockey, I certainly would not have gone. I didn't have a great interest in because I just wasn't exposed in university and higher education. But I did go, and I've been on Bay Street here for close to 30 years in a variety of different roles. Usually it's risk roles, but I was in a law firm, then I went in house, and then I branched out to be a business person, then an entrepreneur. At Bridging Finance, I've been here 8 years. I am an owner here. I'm the CEO, and we're Canada's largest private debt shop. So I don't know if that says much or means much. We manage about 2 billion in the bid market in Canada, and we venture down to the United States as well. And so that's simply doing asset-based lending and something called factoring, buying of blue chip receivables at a discount. And we sell our vehicles through the banks and through the independent dealers in Canada with some institutional money. For instance, our biggest institutional client, or our second biggest, is the University of Minnesota. And I'm very proud that we have a relationship with them. They're very socially conscious people. I like dealing with them. But about 6 years ago, we started doing First Nations financing. I should really say Indigenous financing. And that was something that we had dreamt up here. We looked at the marketplace and we said, well, there's Indigenous banking through the big financial institutions, and that's great. But what about greenfield projects? What about projects that are not as far along, and perhaps FIs, big financial institutions, will not touch those projects? So our vision was we will go in and we will believe and we will do these projects and we will create wealth and economy for First Nations. And I think we're the only bridge lender to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis in Canada. And then we'll set the groups up to be bankable, and they'll port over to the bank and after their projects that are revenue producing. So really, when I look at what we do for a living, I love all this stuff, but I really love the Indigenous stuff. That's really why I hop out of bed in the morning, and what makes me motivated to work 12 hours a day is for my people. And so I'm First Nations. I'm from Tyndonega, just down the road from Queens. And that's why I went to Queens. My grandmother was alive at the time, living on the reserve, and I wanted to spend time with her. So, like you, Amy, I had a couple of other options, but mine was family driven. And I wanted to be with my grandmother, in our culture, how important our grandparents are, especially our grandmothers, right? And so that was my motivation, knowing nothing about Queens, to tell you the truth, until I got there. And I realized I love the place in some ways, and I really did not like it in other ways. The lack of diversity uh, bothered me a lot. but it equipped me to do what I do today. I have to say that because I had to be somewhat resilient. I think when I was in law school, we had 3 Indigenous people in all 3 years. So we were outliers. And if you try to bring up Indigenous issues in class, you would be literally shouted down. Like that's not black letter law. I don't want to hear this. And that was tough. So it was really difficult to operate in that world. And you had, I felt pretty self conscious about who I was. So that's, I guess, a little bit about me. I'm devoted to Indigenous people in this country and devoted to economic reconciliation.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much for sharing that story with us, talking a little bit about yourself and bridging finance to get that overview. So like you mentioned, actually, obviously bridging finance plays a really big role in helping Indigenous businesses. And one of the reasons that Queen's Conference on Indigenous Reconciliation is around is really that our focus on economic and legal reconciliation. And you mentioned that at the end. So how would you define economic reconciliation and what does it really mean to you?
The definition is probably very expansive, right? Um, Economic reconciliation means equality of opportunity for Indigenous people to be participants in the economy and to be at the table, to be at the boardroom table making decisions for our fate and for generations to come. So it really is that equality of opportunity that's important to me because I just don't see a lot of it. And there's all the traditional excuses why we don't get Indigenous people involved in our economy. And there's so much to do in that. So, but that's my definition. I know it can be much more expansive, but that's what economic reconciliation is for me. It's using the economy and the power and the wealth in this country for our people and for programming in our communities for the effects of economic reconciliation is clean drinking water, uh, adequate housing is very, very important, and food security. Yeah, I travel this country and I go far north and all over the place. So I'm not used to be sitting in an office. Last year in 19, I was on the road every single week. I have a little boy at home, so it's difficult. Who's also a member of Tainanega, but it's my commitment to our people. And when I travel, and this is probably a long answer, uh, when I travel and I see our children and I see these kids and I hate to say it, they're really they're stats. They're stats for the mainstream because we're slotted into these stats. There's reasons, and I don't want to generalize, but there's reasons why our children aren't finishing school. And the reason is we don't have adequate housing and we don't have food security. So imagine you see these kids, and I go in the north. I spend a lot of time up there, and it's the south too. It's BC. It's everywhere. It's not just the Arctic or Northern Ontario. You see these kids. You say these delightful little children. You say you're not going to have the same quality of opportunity because you are going to school hungry. You are going to school living with 5 or 6 families because there isn't adequate housing provided by our government and the federal government. It's a federal concern. And how is that kid supposed to study? That kid's just surviving. So that's the participation in the economy that we must have. Like, why do we have to send our children from Northern Ontario to school in Thunder Bay and Sioux Lookout? Why don't we have a school up in these communities? We have the money in Canada. Why don't we have that? So these are the things that lead to economic reconciliation. When we have the programming, we have the the sharing of resources, financial resources with our people.
It's really great. Thank you for sharing that. Means a lot to me as well as an Indigenous woman in business. And economic reconciliation is something that, I really want to work towards in my lifetime and hopefully see great change here in Canada.
Come to visit sometime, when you're done, and come to visit, and we can talk more about that for sure. Because we need people like you both who care.
Yeah, thank you. So you told us previously that you have a relationship with the 13 Mi'kmaq First Nations, as well as one of the founders of Clearwater. What were some of the challenges in bringing these two parties together? And was Clearwater looking to sell the company at the time?
It's interesting. So I'll give you a little bit of background. So there's three owners of Clearwater. It's John Risley and the two McDonald brothers, Mickey and Colin. And I know all three. So John, it would be somebody I do business with, or we do here. I know him well. And the McDonald brothers are investors in our company. They own our funds. And so I know John better, and I got to know the McDonald brothers just through business. And I heard grumblings that they were sellers, and the I guess the rumor was that the children didn't want to be in the business. And as you know, Clearwater is one of the biggest seafood companies in the world, and it's always nice to for the next generation to come in. But if they're not interested, they're not interested. So what do you do with that if they're sellers? So they have Indigenous experience. Of the three, more John Risley. He has done things with Indigenous people, and I've been to his house, and I've been to his lodge in Labrador, just chock full of Indigenous art. He has a passion for the people, non-Indigenous, of course, but they had experience with First Nations. They did a deal with Membertou First Nation in Cape Breton Island. So they did that deal. I think it was for the Surf Clan. They sold um, part of a license to Membertou, and that is a coup. If you have a Surf Clan license, I believe it was Surf Clan, that's you print money, and you think about food security and all the mouths to feed around the globe. Food business is a good business. So John was passionate. We have Chief Terry Paul. If you know Chief Terry Paul, a friend of mine who is the chief of Membertou and in Sydney, Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton. And so they had experience, right? Um, for us here, we've done two deals with the Mi'kmaq. Right now, all 13 First Nations, Mi'kmaq First Nations, are partners of us. We did cannabis with them. They are the majority owner of probably the best facility in the country. And I always said I was running around the country trying to argue for equality with the federal government, and they regulate the production of cannabis, and the provincial governments they regulate the sale of cannabis. And we were an afterthought. We weren't even a thought actually. First Nations, we just weren't. They didn't talk about us in the legislation, and that was an opportunity the governments could have used for First Nations economic reconciliation. And that was a new buffalo for us, and it could have been lucrative. But the Mi'kmaq, through spending lots of time with them, going to their ledge assembly, speaking to all the chiefs and counselors and elders, and saying, let's do this, let's do this, let's do this. We have the capital available to you. And finally, they jumped and they did it. And they have the state of the art facility just outside of Halifax. And they're doing so well. Their EBITDA is off the charts. They have a second phase going in. So that was our experience. And I'm told it was only the third time in the history of the Mi'kmaq that all the First Nations came together on a transaction. And that's hard. But think about that. When you have to convince 13 chiefs and council and elders, and they all went to a community vote. So all 13 had to go and have, are we going to do this, right? So there's a lot to overcome. And so we did this, and I'm proud that we did this. Then I hear about Clearwater, and John is a fine gentleman. I sit on a board with him. I've gotten to know him. Serial entrepreneur, one of Canada's billionaires, and I just started hounding him, and it didn't take much effort with John. He was a believer, and I said, John, this is the opportunity where you can make a difference, and this will be a model for the rest of the country to follow. It reminds me of the deal out with the Mikisew in Alberta, and I think it's Fort McMurray First Nation, Mikisew, when they did the Suncor storage facility, and I think they floated a bond to do that. $500 million deal. So only affected 2 First Nations, I believe, maybe a third. And that was a great deal. And I said, John, you're going to be the Mikisew of the Atlantic Canada, and let's do this. So he was in. I went fishing with him, and started talking to him. I brought the Inuit down as well. I said, well, why don't we include the Inuit of Labrador? And it didn't work out that way. They had other goals, but I brought in Clint Davis, if you know Clint, who's leads economic development in Labrador for the Inuit people, and brought him in, and we went to Clearwater, and then we flew to see Chief Terry, a member too. But the real key to this transaction were the McDonald brothers. Had to convince them. Wonderful people, corporate captains, they care. But you know what the perception of our people is? And you can guess, is that we never get anything done. And that was one concern. We can flip this Clearwater to a pension plan or any seafood company globally, anywhere, and we have a buyer. We have a market. So they didn't have to create a market. So what did we use as a lever? A couple of things. This is your moral responsibility. That we're talking about food resources. We're talking about sustainable fisheries, and we're talking about people who traditionally have been fisher people, right? These Mi'kmaq, they are out there, and they have passion, right? And so, but how I had to put it to them, it was quite simple. Business people are business people, and there's got to be something that makes sense. It was this: do you want to protect your quota? So do you want to sell this to whomever? And the federal government will come in and say, well, we're going to, especially if it's a foreign player, we're going to cut your quota. And it would hurt their legacy. You think they're going to do that to First Nations? I doubt it. The federal government, I don't think, will touch quota. And I said, well, this is what you can do to preserve your legacy. So it was many visits with the McDonald's, very big respect for them. I had John as a champion, and we went through a few different iterations where different structures, and they didn't all work out. But I would have loved to have seen 100% ownership by the Mi'kmaq. But it's a big ticket, right? It is a big ticket, but there's all kinds of interesting things that Mi'kmaq have done. I have to say they've created an ECDEV, Economic Development Corporation, for all 13, and pooled their money. So that was very wise. You have to admit, when you see in Canada, and when you look at our First Nations, why don't we use them as an example? We don't often come together to do things. We hurt each other, and we compete against each other. And why aren't we combining our forces and our resources? Because we have more bargaining power. So that was the clincher, really, was this to say you want to protect your legacy, but they really care about First Nations people. They really, really do. And that's important that they do. I mean, it's important to Canada, right? So that's how it went about doing this. Was I just persistent, annoying, I'm sure, but I said you could make it. You could really make a difference here.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear that story, and how a lot of collaboration, different parties came together to make this happen. What were some of the key takeaways from this transaction that you really want people to know about?
That it makes a lot of sense, this transaction. It makes a lot of sense for the country. So we have a problem in Canada. I think we can all admit that. We have a people that have been persecuted since the beginning of this country. We have an act that is racist. In the Indian Act, we can't create wealth because of the inherent restrictions in that act for our people. And it's sad, and it continues, right? So the key takeaway for me, really, and I say when I speak about our initiatives here with Indigenous groups, is that Indigenous business is great business. This is not charity. that we are entrepreneurs. You go to most communities, and you know this. You go in the community, go look at this. These are all like micro entrepreneurs all over the place, and we just want the opportunity to participate. So a key takeaway is really belief. But because we have this issue in the country, the only two ways that I know to improve our lot and lives for our Indigenous people is education and is economic development. And so the more corporations, big corporations, view this as an opportunity and not charity, and saying, hey, these are really willing, capable participants in the economy, but we're not going to overcome our challenges in this country. Yeah, we like to hide the way we treated our Indigenous people, but the world knows. Just yesterday, we have the leader of the Conservative Party in this country saying that residential schools were all about education. Is he crazy? Who are his handlers? And then he backtracked. I know the man and his handlers, and he's got to change his views of the way these things work, because that is incredible. Imagine this day and age. It was just yesterday. Did you see that?
I did see
You know,
that, yeah.
it's very sad, right? And so we have a lot of work to do, but the one way we can eliminate and assist is through economic reconciliation.
Yeah, I totally agree as well. So you touched on this a bit before when you're talking about the transaction, but we wanted to know, how could this deal be a model for other partnerships in Canada?
Mhm. Well, it is a model that can be used, and we did touch on it. And one is the pooling of resources, is getting groups that come together. And I'll give you another example in British Columbia. It's MST, if you know them. So it's Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and oh boy, Squamish. Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh. And they have pooled their resources and their buying power and their selling power in the marketplace, and they're just doing wonderfully. But they have the geography. And when you look at Musqueam, they're right on the coast, right by UBC. Uh, so they have the geography, but this can be used anywhere. When you look at Member 2 in Cape Breton Island, they don't have the geography. There's no commerce really there. They created commerce. There was mentions that taking a First Nation that is bolstering the whole region. That's Member 2. They created a conference center. They opened up a hotel, amongst many things. So they're a partner now in another project. We're trying to do a port, and we're trying to do a port in Sydney, Nova Scotia. It's a deep water port, and we're putting our money behind it. But again, it's all 13 Mi'kmaq First Nation. So that's the model, right? No one First Nation could do that port, but all 13. And if some have to drop off, and it might happen, that's fine. But that's really the model we can use, and it's really ensuring that there's timely access to capital for First Nations. And what a guy like John Risley in Clearwater could do is, and this is what they did, they used their power in this country with the banks and others to help the Mi'kmaq get financing. So the Mi'kmaq, they went to Bank of Montreal, and Bank of Montreal is a big player in Indigenous financing, and they assisted. And so they were very determined to get this done, and we can do this in other parts of the country. Absolutely. So let's stop fighting each other. That sort of crab in the bucket type thing, and we all want to pull each other down. It's real, but let's go in together as a combined force and fight it out, and say no. Well, this isn't our traditional territory. No, it's not that we don't want to stop projects. We want thoughtful projects where we're participants and it's fair.
Yeah, that's some really great insight. And you talked about this briefly, but more broadly, beyond just this transaction, what are some of the obstacles that First Nations and Indigenous businesses face in this quest for economic reconciliation and being seen as equal participants in the economy?
Yeah, I touched a little bit on that. It's timely access to capital. We love the banks, and we have five big ones in this country. So it's very tight. You go to the United States, and there's a different bank on every street corner, it seems, right? All these regional banks. There's more access to capital. Here you have five opportunities, and you pull in Laurentian and National Bank, and maybe Desjardins, First Nations Finance Authority. It's very limited. It's probably less than 10 or 15 institutions where you can get money. You might be able to go to ATB in Alberta, but it's timely access. And what we say to our banking friends, we do a lot with the Bank of Montreal. And we say um, they're great. They have a $4.5 billion, maybe $5 billion Indigenous lending book. They've told us and they've announced that they're going to get to 8 billion by 2023, 24, something like this. But and I don't want to poke the banks, but that the banks are slow. The banks have been slow for 150 years, and they're not going to get any faster. So with our seasons here, and if you're trying to build something, we built a Loblaws and PharmaSave in LC Pugtug in New Brunswick. And they, for food security, create 60 jobs with 80% unemployment. They wanted that Loblaws for 20 years, literally. And they go through that cycle. Okay, we're in the queue with the bank or banks, and then we missed the building season because there's shorter seasons here, right? Miss the building, and then do it again, and do it again. So the bank is not. They have the best of intentions, but it's just not going to happen in the timing that the First Nation requires. And again, when you look at these projects, the banks don't like taking on construction financing, and they have very capable regional managers who are Indigenous, but it just wasn't happening. So you need players who are going to go in and saying, we're going to give you timely access to capital. Timely means not 6 months. Mm-hmm. And I'll give you an example. I'm working with a group, I just saw their emailing as we're talking in Nunavut. Yeah, Inuit Hunter and Trappers organization, and they want to buy a boat. So they want to fish, and they already have a boat, and they want to buy an 80-meter Arctic trawler from Greenland. It's used, built in 2019. It's a big boat. And there's a very wealthy individual in Greenland who said, okay, I'll give you a right, the first right to buy this, but you have this period of time to get the capital. And they desperately want that boat. And if they had to go to a bank, and they're smarter operators, if they had to go to a bank, they know that the bank is not going to be able to do it. They're just not. And they're going to miss that opportunity. We can do that in 2 weeks. And only because, I'll hop on a plane, I'll go to Greenland, I'll look at the boat. I do that tomorrow. We can get that deal done. And we have done Arctic trawlers for the Inuit before, and we could do it very quickly. And then what we do is we just use our cost of capital. We take all the risk up front. We get the boat Canadianized, and then we flip it over to a bank when it's revenue producing, and they get 3 to 5% money or whatever it is, much cheaper cost to capital. So it's that timely access to capital. So why are we bridging finance? We're 40 people here. Why are we the only bridge lender to Indigenous groups in Canada? There's a problem, is there, with that? I'd say we want the competition. We want people to come in. We're on the debt side, but there's also an absence on the equity side with First Nations and Inuit and Métis. Sorry for all the long answers. You can tell I'm very passionate about this.
No, we love it. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. That's really incredible, especially what you're doing, like with bridging finance. I think that's so important, and hopefully more people will follow in your lead.
Oh, thank you very much. So we have to really motivate them to do that. So when I was in Vancouver last week, there's one of these billionaire families who are really committed. The folks who own the Vancouver Canucks, I'm close with, the Aquilini family, and so I spent a day with them, talking with them, and they're committed to First Nations. They do stuff with Musqueam and some of the other First Nations. But we're the other billionaire families in the country. I think they're learning, and I think it's our responsibility to teach them. So we've had the opportunity
Yeah.
to see with the Thompson family, the richest family. We have something called the Indigenous Impact Fund, and they've dipped their toe in the younger generation of the family, and so they're giving us money, and they want to go to. And you'll love this. They want to go to a community. They want to go and see one of our First Nation partners and what we're doing. So we're building houses with Peguis First Nation in Manitoba, and they want to come and see it. So you know what, I get excited about that because imagine that it's one of the richest families in the world, and they care about our people, and we need more Canadians like that.
For sure. So we're getting towards the end of our questions here. This is the second last one. What experience in your education and early life really helped you, helped shape you to who you are today and what you advocate for?
It's a tough one. I've talked about shame, so I look the way I look. My wife would say, "Well, you're white facing." Is I guess we've heard that phrase. And if you ever been in communities, there are lots of people who look like me, and lots of people look different than me, right? And it's all about our hearts and who we are, right? But that is that shame of being who you are made me who I was today, and I'm not even sure what I am, but I try hard at everything I do. But I'm not proud of this, but I hid, right, to try to get on, and there's a lot of shame in that. So if you don't come from money, you're going to feel all this stuff too when you're making money, because you're going to feel shame about making money. Boy, that took me about 15 years to get over with. Like, I don't deserve this. I don't, I love it. So I'm here on Bay Street, and I get the comments like, "Are you Italian? You must be from the Mediterranean. I have light eyes, and you must be from the Mediterranean." And I hid, and it's so embarrassing. I hid and didn't say who I was, because I wasn't ashamed of who I was. It was the shame that we had as people. Like, I won't fit in. And you might experience this when you go to Wall Street, Bay Street, or any street, that people they want to deal with people like themselves. And maybe it's less so now, but I don't think so. I'm here in Bay Street, and I see it. They want to deal with people like themselves. And so when I was at Queens, and I never forget this, and I'll get to the point of the shaping in a second, but there's this exercise in the first day of law school. You had to turn to the person next to you and tell that person about who you are. And I knew nothing about law. I didn't know what a tort was. I thought it was probably like a pie or something. So it's really embarrassing, right? And I have to tell this person. So I did, and they looked at me like, "You're a complete loser." I still know who this person is, and she's a kind-hearted person, but she wasn't used to me. I wasn't used to her. She came from a long line of lawyers, and I was intimidated. So the being embarrassed, I'm not even sure why I was embarrassed, except we're poor, and there's lots of racism. There's lots of racism, and it's shameful. I experience it, and I see it. I don't like it, and it's systemic, and it's overt as well. So when I came out and said, "This is who I am," it was those learnings that just drove me. I'll never do that again, where I'm going to hide and not represent. And it wasn't that I was trying to be. I was just afraid. Literally afraid, because there's no one here that I can find. There's maybe a handful who have our background. There just isn't. So that taught me something, right? And the other thing that taught me something was, when you don't know when your parents can't afford groceries, And that struggle, and you're going really from one paycheck to paycheck. And as a little kid, you can see that with your parents. It taught me that I must go to school. I knew that I would be pumping gas, and there's nothing wrong with pumping gas, or working in a factory like my dad. And when he had a job, when he could find work, uh, but I knew that if you get education, no one can take that away from you. And so that really drove me. And so that's why I say education really, that is our new buffalo. The more we of our kids and 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 people like you who finish school and go on and do great things and be committed, but it's not easy. So that's a driver. I mean, we all have a responsibility here, right? And not everyone's going to go to school, but how about an opportunity to get a trade as well? There's all kinds of things, and so we need entrepreneurs who are dedicated to this. I have some business partners who are utterly despicable, and they just use our people for their own gain, and I know they don't care about us. I know that. But I'll say this to you, and one another teaching is, and I use this metaphor, is I feel like a little squirrel. I said this a few times in my speaking. I'm in my little hole, and I run out and I grab a little piece of power, and I run back to my hole, and I keep on doing it. And this power dynamic, maybe they won't realize until we've shifted that power. So we're just grabbing little nuggets of power for our people, because even with these partners I have, and you'll experience this. You'll deal with people you don't want to deal with, but you have to do it, and you're not selling out because you're grabbing pieces of power for your people. And I've tried to teach them. I brought in elders, and I try to teach them that the value of our way of life and our thinking, and it's a mockery really, but if they can provide some jobs, and then they don't even know, but we'll use them as a tool. We'll use them as an implement because they have power, and I want that power for our people. So sorry again for the long answer, but I feel strongly about that. I really do, that we got to shift this dynamic, and this stuff, it continues. And I'll give you an example. The stuff that's happening in Nova Scotia with the lobster fishery. What in the world is that? That's downright racism. So you say we're drunken Indians, we're lazy Indians, all these stereotypes, and sort of use the word Indian, but it still says that in our status card, right? That you're an Indian. So, and they say that, and so these people, it's gone to the Supreme Court of Canada. They have a right to earn a living, moderate, whatever that means, but it's there. And they say, okay, we're going to develop the fisheries. We're going to develop a local economy. And that conservation argument is bunk. It's just a terrible argument. If you actually studied it and said, I'm sure you have, but this is not a conservation issue. It is not a conservation. This is a racism issue. So essentially what this is, yeah, okay, maybe you're not being lazy and you want a job, but you can't have these jobs. You can't have these lucrative jobs, and for your children and for your community, this lobster fisher people, you can't have those jobs. So we have a long way to go, and we need people like the both of you who care, and you're going to have power. Queen's Commerce is an outstanding program, and you're going to go on and do great things. I'm confident of that. And you're going to go to law school, and you're going to do great things, but these are things we have to be aware of. Can I tell you one more thing before I know you have to go? But I have a little measurement. I do. And it's because of the way I look, and people really don't know my background. But I travel a lot. And when there's a body of water, I love to go fishing. I love to fish. And I always say, people, and I say, well, yeah, look at that great lake there. It's a wonderful lake. What do you fish for there? And this is just a racism measure, and it happens right across the country. Oh, we used to fish whatever, salmon, and if there's a First Nation close by, but there's no more salmon because the First Nations, they fished it out. And you wouldn't believe, were you sure they're right across. So there's 100, people in that First Nation, and this is a town of 75,000, and 100 people fish that lake out. Eh? That's amazing. But I hear it all the time, and it's just it's a measure of I guess it's a microcosm measure of people's reaction in this country to our people. Anyhow, I could go to midnight and talk about stuff.
Oh, thank
No,
you
we
for
really
that.
appreciate hearing that. Yeah, it can be daunting, looking ahead and looking back and asking, what can I do? I'm only one person. And I guess that kind of moves us into the last question that we had for you today, which is really, what advice do you have for future, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students who want to be leaders in this space and want to make reconciliation a reality?
Yeah, well, we need non-Indigenous for sure, people who care, and because we can't do it alone. So when you speak to people and you're carrying the flag for economic reconciliation, is to bring converts over, you know, everyday Canadians, and say, well, this is important. And so that's the advice. Don't stop. I'm not going to stop until I die, and because this is too important, right? And we have to drill this into people. Quality of opportunity and jobs for our people. We want to work, right? We want to provide for our families. So you're change agents. You probably don't even know you're change agents, and maybe you know, but you are, because you care. And going to Queen's Commerce, very prestigious, and you gotta, don't stop caring, right? Because you can make a difference, and it's one person at a time. I always say that, but it's exhausting. It is absolutely exhausting. So it's because I take it very seriously, but it is one person at a time, and spending time with those people and saying and educating them. So I've done that with, I'll give you an example. I get some interesting opportunities with the Canadian Space Agency. So I take the astronauts around and to communities. And so our next astronaut to go to space, his every astronaut has a cause. His cause is Indigenous youth. And we go from community to community, and the space agency and NASA, they have to sign off on that, and they bring handlers for him, and he comes and speaks to our children. And the goal there is, if one child would stay in school because they spoke to Jeremy Hansen, then we've done our job. But you got to make the time. It is time consuming. So keep on fighting. It's important, right? But it's important for our children.
Well, thank you so much. It was truly an honor to speak with you today and hear from you, because I know I'm personally walking away feeling incredibly inspired, motivated, and educated by what you had to share. And I hope that everyone else who has the chance to watch this will feel that way as well.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you for your
I
time.
agree.
And sorry I went on a lot. And thank you for organizing this.